Was Islam born from Judaism? The truth hidden for 400 years. For 14 centuries, the world has been told that Islam emerged as a final and separate revelation. But what if its deepest roots lie not in Arabia alone, but in the ancient laws, prophets, and battles of Judaism? Tonight, we uncover the buried truth that reshaped two civilizations and still fuels conflict today. In the deserts of Arabia 1400 years ago, a new voice rose claiming to restore the original faith of Abraham. It called itself Islam, submission to the one God. To its followers, it was the final and perfect revelation. To the world, it appeared as a sudden religious revolution that would soon overturn empires. But history rarely moves in clean beginnings. Every great belief system is born from older soil, shaped by forgotten debates, inherited scriptures, and unresolved sacred conflicts. Long before Islam emerged, Judaism had already wrestled for centuries with questions of law, prophecy, exile, and divine covenant. Its scriptures shaped the moral backbone of the ancient Near East. Its prophets warned kingdoms. Its people survived without power, sustained only by text and tradition, and it was into a world already structured by Jewish law, Christian theology, and imperial politics that Islam was born. The Quran speaks the names of Moses, Abraham, and David more than those of any Arab ancestors. Islamic law mirrors ancient Hebrew commandments with striking precision. The early Muslim community lived side by side with Jewish tribes who guarded the very texts Islam claimed to confirm. These are not coincidences, they are fingerprints of origin. Yet the relationship between Islam and Judaism is not remembered as a peaceful intellectual inheritance. It is remembered as rivalry, conflict, expulsion, and eventually centuries of hierarchy and domination. What began as shared prophecy hardened into theological competition. What began as recognition became rejection. And what began as kinship became one of the most enduring religious political fault lines in world history. So the forbidden question remains, was Islam truly born independent of Judaism? Or did it rise from within the shadow of Jewish revelation, reshaping it, challenging it, and ultimately redefining it for the world? Tonight, we trace the hidden genealogy of faith itself. The world into which Islam would eventually be born was already alive with memory, law, and the weight of divine expectation. Long before the Arabian desert saw the first revelation of Muhammad, the Jewish people had already endured a tumultuous history that shaped both their religious imagination and their survival instincts. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was not simply a physical catastrophe. It was a rupture of national identity, a fracturing of sacred order, and the beginning of a diaspora that would carry Jewish law, scripture, and prophecy into the farthest corners of the ancient world. The temple had been the physical center of divine presence, the axis around which ritual and politics revolved, and its fall forced Judaism into a profound transformation. Without a temple, the people were left with texts, memory, and community as the instruments of survival. Rabbinic leadership arose from this crucible, codifying the oral traditions, shaping the Talmud, and constructing a living legal and moral system that could exist independently of geographic sovereignty. This system was not merely a set of rules, but a comprehensive architecture of life, one that governed ethics, commerce, family, justice, and ritual in every corner of the Jewish world. It became a mobile civilization, portable in law, practice, and identity, capable of existing in exile without surrendering the claim to divine favor. Jewish communities settled not only in Judea and Galilee, but in Babylon, Alexandria, and along the trade routes that linked the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. These communities were interwoven with commerce, scholarship, and diplomacy, acting as nodes of intellectual transmission and economic networks. Yet they were also fiercely autonomous, each guided by local interpretations of law and prophetic memory. Their scriptures carried the stories of Abraham, Moses, David, and the covenant. But these were more than stories. They were a blueprint for survival and governance, for morality and political reasoning in a world often hostile to minorities. This textual civilization was intensely conscious of its historical fragility, aware that survival was contingent not on conquest, but on adherence to law, ritual, and communal cohesion. It was a civilization shaped by repeated exile and the constant need to translate sacred ideals into worldly endurance. As centuries passed, the Jewish people became masters of this delicate balance, creating a moral and legal universe that could travel without borders, influence rulers without becoming rulers, and survive as a culture even without land. By the turn of the 7th century, the Jewish world had grown highly sophisticated in both law and thought. The Mishnah, redacted around 200 CE, had codified centuries of oral law into a written framework that could guide communities far from Jerusalem. This was not simply legalistic, it was philosophical, ethical, and deeply spiritual, outlining how humans should live in accordance with divine command. Commentaries and the eventual Talmudic expansions provided expansive debate, preserving multiple interpretations, testing legal boundaries, and encouraging intellectual rigor. The rabbis cultivated a civilization where law and narrative were inseparable, where the stories of the past were inseparable from the actions of the present. Every commandment, ritual, and tradition was embedded with historical memory, reminding the Jewish people of exile, persecution, and the imperatives of fidelity to God's covenant. This legal and textual sophistication was coupled with an acute understanding of political reality. Jews were acutely aware of the dangers of sovereignty lost and the limitations of minority existence. They learned to navigate empires, Roman, Byzantine, and Persian, maintaining internal cohesion while externally negotiating survival. These experiences created a culture of strategic thinking, a nuanced awareness of power, authority, and negotiation, tempered by ethical imperatives. Jewish law thus served not only as a spiritual guide, but as a political instrument, enabling communities to persist in complex, often hostile, environments. Trade and mobility were crucial to Jewish survival and influence. Jewish merchants and communities were strategically positioned across Arabia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, facilitating economic networks that tied distant populations together. This network was both commercial and intellectual, transmitting legal interpretations, philosophical discussions, and scriptural exegesis along routes that linked the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean. In cities like Yathrib, later known as Medina, Jewish tribes had established agricultural settlements and controlled significant local resources. These tribes were deeply rooted in Jewish law, practice, and communal organization. Yet they were also adept at navigating the tribal politics of the Arabian Peninsula. The Jewish presence in these regions was neither marginal nor passive. It was strategically significant, socially integrated, and politically influential. The interactions between Jewish communities and Arab tribes shaped the cultural and intellectual landscape of the Arabian Peninsula in ways that would directly influence the emergence of Islam. The Jews of Medina, in particular, maintained their traditions with discipline, observing the Sabbath, dietary laws, and ritual purity, while also engaging in trade, alliances, and negotiations with neighboring tribes. This coexistence created both a model and a tension, as local Arab populations observed Jewish legal rigor and prophetic heritage, even as political allegiances shifted with tribal interests and economic needs. The Arabian desert was thus not a blank slate, but a landscape densely populated by ideas, laws, and competing visions of divine authority. Islam would emerge into a world already structured by centuries of legalistic precision, prophetic memory, and political awareness. Judaism's theological structure was equally sophisticated. The concept of God as both universal and covenantal created a framework that shaped moral and political thought. God was not merely a tribal deity, he was the lawgiver, judge, and covenant keeper for a people whose survival depended on fidelity to his commandments. The prophets had established the principle that obedience to divine law ensured not only spiritual legitimacy, but practical protection, even under foreign domination. This theology instilled a rigorous ethical consciousness, binding community life, leadership, and justice to sacred law. It emphasized accountability, debate, and interpretation, insisting that the righteous action of individuals and communities had both spiritual and political consequences. This intellectual rigor and moral focus were deeply influential, not only internally, but also in shaping the perceptions and expectations of surrounding populations. Arabs, Christians, and other religious groups encountered Jewish communities as highly disciplined, ethically aware, and legally sophisticated, creating both admiration and tension. These encounters established patterns of influence, competition, and adaptation that would later be central to the emergence of Islam. The Quranic emphasis on many of the same prophets and laws was not occurring in isolation. It was interacting with a living, observant Jewish presence whose intellectual and moral authority was undeniable. As the Arabian Peninsula entered the 7th century, the political landscape was fragmented but densely interwoven with religious and legal traditions. Various tribes competed for dominance, trade routes, and alliances. Christianity had already made inroads in Yemen and along the coasts, while Jewish communities were strategically dispersed across key settlements. The interplay between tribal politics, commerce, and religious identity created a dynamic and often volatile environment. Into this context stepped Muhammad, whose prophetic claims and subsequent community-building efforts could not be understood outside of these existing structures. The knowledge, laws, and narratives of Judaism were already part of the Arabian consciousness, offering both a template and a challenge for the emerging Islamic revelation. The Quran's invocation of Moses, Abraham, David, and other figures familiar to Jewish audiences was immediately intelligible within a world deeply conversant with these texts. The early Muslims were not creating a religion in a vacuum. They were interpreting, confirming, and contesting existing sacred traditions in real-time political and social engagement. The Jewish world, with its centuries of exile law and textual authority, provided both a model for the codification of divine command and a source of opposition that would shape the early trajectory of Islam. The legal precision, ethical reasoning, and prophetic authority of Judaism offered a mirror in which the early Islamic community saw its own ambitions, its own limits, and its own challenges. This was a world where theology, law, and politics were inseparable, where survival demanded negotiation between divine mandate and worldly reality, and where the seeds of conflict and synthesis were already sown. Judaism had created a civilization capable of existing without sovereignty, capable of shaping neighboring cultures, and capable of imposing moral and intellectual order without political dominion. Islam would inherit this complex environment, drawing from it, contesting it, and ultimately transforming it into a new civilization with its own universal ambitions. When Muhammad first received what he proclaimed to be the divine revelation, he entered a world already dense with prophetic memory, law, and covenantal expectation. He was not creating theology from nothing. He was speaking into a continuum, addressing tribes, merchants, and Jewish communities who had long practiced ritual, law, and ethical deliberation rooted in centuries of sacred tradition. The Quran does not emerge in a vacuum. It constantly gestures backward to the covenant, to Abraham, to Moses, to David, and to the prophets whose narratives form the moral architecture of the Near East. From the first revelation in the cave of Hira, Muhammad positioned himself not merely as a prophet of Arabia, but as a confirmer of prior revelation, a restorer of divine law that had been altered, corrupted, or forgotten. His earliest followers were drawn from those who already understood the ethical grammar of Scripture, individuals who had observed the Sabbath, followed dietary law, honored lineage, and participated in the interpretive debates of a literate, textually aware culture. The Jewish prophetic tradition, with its insistence on obedience to God's law as a vehicle for both survival and legitimacy, provided the spiritual vocabulary through which the nascent Muslim community could understand itself. The stories of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, of Abraham's covenant, and of David's kingship were repeated in the Quran not as historical curiosities but as living templates, models of obedience, leadership, and moral struggle. In many ways, the Quran's narrative strategy is dialogical. It speaks to Jewish memory even as it asserts its own authority, creating a conversation that blends confirmation and critique, admiration and correction. Early Muslims were expected to recognize these figures not as distant ancestors, but as exemplars of law, prophecy, and ethical action, even as Muhammad claimed a finality that would redefine the prophetic tradition. The relationship between Muhammad and Jewish communities was complex, marked by cooperation, dialogue, and eventual rupture. In Medina, Jewish tribes like the Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza held land, controlled commerce, and administered their own internal law according to halakha. They observed the Sabbath, maintained dietary laws, and followed established prophetic traditions, all within a tribal political landscape that required careful negotiation. Muhammad's early constitution in Medina, sometimes called the Constitution of Medina, positioned Jews as part of a wider community united by mutual obligations and defense agreements, acknowledging their religious autonomy while integrating them into the political life of the city. This arrangement initially suggested that Islam, while claiming universality, recognized the legitimacy of Jewish law and prophecy. The Quran praises Moses repeatedly and speaks of the children of Israel as witnesses to God's favor and tests, indicating a deep intertextual awareness of Jewish history and scripture. However, these confirmations carried with them an implicit expectation, recognition of Muhammad's own prophetic role. The Quran repeatedly asserts that Jews would know the truth, and yet, through disobedience or disbelief, failed to accept the final revelation. This tension between recognition and rejection set the stage for both theological and political confrontation, as the nascent Muslim community sought legitimacy not only in divine terms, but also in the practical governance of Medina. As revelations continued, the Quran increasingly emphasized both affirmation of prior law and correction of perceived deviations. Laws regarding ritual, ethical behavior, and community obligations often mirrored Jewish commandments, yet were modified to reflect the needs of an emerging political and religious community. The prohibition of usury, dietary prescriptions, and rules of inheritance show structural similarities to Jewish halakha, demonstrating not only the influence of the earlier legal system, but also the conscious adaptation of that system to serve a broader, unifying religious and social agenda. Prophets known to the Jewish tradition are recontextualized, sometimes chastised, sometimes elevated, always used to validate the claim that the final revelation was unfolding. In this sense, Islam initially functioned as both continuation and correction, drawing authority from the weight of Jewish memory while asserting its own transcendent legitimacy. The early Muslim community's interaction with Jewish tribes exemplifies this dual function. Cooperation, commerce, intermarriage, and political alliances existed alongside theological competition, legal reinterpretation, and eventually confrontation. The break between Islam and Judaism was neither immediate nor inevitable, but it became increasingly pronounced as Muhammad's political and theological authority grew. Initial expectations of recognition were frustrated by Jewish resistance, debate, and critique. When the Quran predicted that the children of Israel would acknowledge the prophet, and yet many failed to do so, the text framed this not as mere disobedience, but as a moral and spiritual failure with political consequences. This conceptual framing transformed everyday interactions into a cosmic narrative, where compliance or refusal was measured against divine standard and prophetic destiny. In Medina, tensions escalated into overt political conflict. Tribes that had been initially aligned with Muhammad found themselves in opposition, negotiations failed, and disputes over allegiance, land, and law escalated into sieges and expulsions. The social and military consequences of these theological disagreements cannot be separated from the religious logic that produced them. When a tribe rejected the prophet, it was not merely a local political decision, it was framed as resistance to divine will, rebellion against God's plan, and denial of prophecy. These judgments had both spiritual and material weight, leading to the expulsion of Jewish tribes, confiscation of property, and the establishment of Islam as a distinct polity. The trajectory from confirmation to break demonstrates the intimate entanglement of law, prophecy, and politics in the earliest Muslim community, revealing that Islam's separation from Judaism was a process both negotiated and enforced, both spiritual and pragmatic, both internal and external. The Quran's narrative strategy during this period demonstrates a careful rhetorical balance. It simultaneously affirms Jewish law and prophets while asserting the necessity of accepting Muhammad as the final messenger. Verses regarding Moses, Aaron, and David often emphasize obedience, justice, and divine instruction, presenting a mirror in which Jewish communities might recognize themselves. Yet by highlighting the failures or disobedience of earlier prophets or their communities, the text establishes a theological framework for why a new revelation was necessary. The result is a dynamic in which Islam defines itself in relation to Judaism, not by outright rejection at first, but by a series of nuanced confirmations, critiques, and reinterpretations that progressively assert Islamic universality. Early Muslim practice, prayer, fasting, zakat, pilgrimage, emerged alongside these theological assertions, demonstrating how religious ritual, law, and identity were intertwined with the negotiation of authority over shared sacred history. The insistence on submission to God alone, combined with reinterpretation of legal and prophetic traditions, allowed Islam to claim both continuity with and correction of Judaism. This dual function created both cognitive resonance and social tension, fostering a relationship in which Jewish knowledge shaped Muslim understanding even as it became increasingly contested. The shift from affirmation to confrontation reached a decisive point with the conflicts in Medina. Initially, Muhammad's approach sought coexistence, integrating Jewish tribes into a wider ummah while respecting their autonomy. Yet political pressures, combined with the refusal of some tribes to recognize his prophetic authority, led to a restructuring of the city's alliances and a reevaluation of communal obligations. The Quran records these moments with a tone that blends historical recounting, moral instruction, and legal precedent, illustrating how religious narrative, community survival, and political necessity are inseparable. Expulsions and sieges were framed as moral imperatives, justified by divine revelation, yet rooted in the practical reality of securing a nascent state under threat. The resulting Muslim community was no longer merely a spiritual movement confirming Jewish prophetic heritage. It had become a distinct polity capable of defending itself, legislating law, and asserting theological authority independent of Jewish recognition. The break was thus both ideological and political, an acknowledgement that coexistence had limits when legitimacy, law, and divine mandate intersected with human allegiance. By the end of Muhammad's life, Islam had fully transitioned from a confirming movement into an independent revelation with its own corpus of law, ritual, and political authority. The Quran's repeated references to Jewish prophets in Scripture were transformed from invitations to recognition into frameworks for theological distinction. The emphasis on submission, communal obedience, and divine justice established Islam as a universal religion, while the conflicts with Jewish tribes established a model for navigating recognition, refusal, and political enforcement. The nascent Muslim community now understood itself as inheriting the prophetic mission of Judaism, while also asserting its own finality and authority, marking the point at which theological conversation became historical separation. This separation, born from recognition and rejection, affirmation and correction, negotiation and conflict, would echo across centuries, shaping not only the legal and moral imagination of both faiths, but also the political and social realities of the Middle East. The story of Muhammad and the Jewish prophetic tradition is therefore one of profound interplay, of borrowing, of confirmation, and of eventual break. It is a story of law-shaping politics, of memory-shaping revelation, and of recognition shaping separation. Islam was born into a Jewish world that was sophisticated, literate, and ethically rigorous, drawing from it not only narrative content, but the very logic of prophetic authority, legal reasoning, and ethical accountability. The resulting divergence, however, was inevitable once claims to finality and political authority emerged. Judaism, with its centuries of exile and textual mastery, provided the canvas upon which Islam painted a universal vision. Yet the very act of painting over created rupture. The relationship between the two traditions during Muhammad's life demonstrates that religious identity is inseparable from political reality, that Scripture functions as both moral compass and instrument of governance, and that theological dialogue can harden into historical separation when recognition and allegiance collide. The echoes of this formative encounter continue to shape religious, political, and ethical discourses in the modern world, revealing that the earliest years of Islam were not merely spiritual beginnings, but a decisive negotiation with an established prophetic civilization, one whose influence remains visible in the Quran, Sharia, and Muslim imagination. As revelations continued to unfold, the tension between affirmation and separation became increasingly visible in both theology and practice. The Quran frequently recalls the stories of Moses, portraying him as a prophet of unyielding law, moral courage, and divine obedience, and by extension reminding early Muslims of the enduring covenantal ethic that Judaism had already perfected. Yet these stories are presented in a way that highlights both continuity and correction. The children of Israel, despite divine favor, are depicted as occasionally failing their covenant, prone to disobedience, doubt, and idolatry, illustrating why a new final messenger was necessary. Muhammad's role, therefore, was framed not as a rebel against tradition, but as a culmination and rectification of it. This duality, honoring prior revelation while asserting finality, created a dynamic theological environment in which Islam could claim both inheritance and independence. In practical terms, it meant that Muslim law, ethics, and ritual would echo Jewish precedent while deliberately modifying it to accommodate the social and political realities of the Arabian Peninsula. Dietary laws were preserved but streamlined, sacrificial rituals adapted into symbolic forms, and legal obligations codified to unify a community that combined tribal, mercantile, and spiritual networks. These adaptations reveal that early Islam did not reject the Jewish prophetic heritage. It selectively incorporated it, transforming inherited frameworks into instruments for a new universal religion. The complexity of the relationship is nowhere more evident than in Medina, where Jewish tribes were deeply integrated into the city's social and economic fabric. The Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza were not passive observers. They were stakeholders in trade, agriculture, and governance, wielding real influence and commanding resources that made them essential yet independent actors within the emerging Muslim polity. Muhammad initially recognized their legal autonomy, allowing them to administer halakha internally, maintain religious observances, and engage in customary commerce. The early constitution codified mutual obligations of defense, mediation, and civic cooperation, positioning Jewish tribes as both autonomous and bound within the broader framework of Medina's community. This arrangement suggests that Islam's initial stance was one of recognition and inclusion, understanding that survival in a politically fragmented environment required alliances, negotiation, and respect for pre-existing legal and religious authority. The early Muslim emphasis on justice, fairness, and protection of rights was directly informed by the presence of these literate, observant Jewish communities, whose sophistication in law and politics could not be ignored. Yet the conditionality of this inclusion was evident. Recognition of Muhammad's prophetic authority and alignment with the broader ethical and political aims of the Ummah were non-negotiable prerequisites for lasting coexistence. As disputes emerged, the tension between inherited recognition and emerging authority intensified. Jewish resistance to Muhammad's claim, whether interpreted as disbelief, political maneuvering, or a combination of both, forced the Quran and the early Muslim community to negotiate new boundaries. The evolution of Quranic rhetoric demonstrates this process, moving from inclusive confirmation of Jewish prophecy to pointed critique and delineation of new divine authority. The text increasingly emphasizes the consequences of refusal. Historical examples of disobedience are cited as cautionary tales, warnings of divine judgment, and moral lessons for the Muslim community. These passages serve a dual function. They legitimize Muhammad's authority in religious terms, while simultaneously providing a framework for political action. Expulsions, sieges, and confiscation of property, then, were not arbitrary. They were embedded within a moral narrative that justified the consolidation of political power in terms of divine mandate. The transformation of theological disagreement into political reality illustrates how intimately law, prophecy, and authority were intertwined in the early Islamic state. Separation was not the result of pure enmity. It was the outcome of a negotiated struggle over recognition, allegiance, and the interpretation of divine will. The legal and ritual innovations that arose during this period further illustrate Islam's engagement with Jewish prophetic tradition. The 5 daily prayers, zakat, fasting, and pilgrimage can all be understood as both independent innovations and as ethical continuations of prior covenantal obligations. Ritual regularity and ethical accountability were central to Jewish law, And Muhammad's adaptation of these principles into a unified communal practice demonstrates the continuity of moral and legal logic. Yet the application and scope were transformed. Obligations became universal rather than tribal. Submission to God was codified as the defining identity of the Ummah, and legal prescriptions were embedded in a political framework that extended beyond local custom. This deliberate blending of inherited law with new communal requirements reflects a conscious strategy of both confirmation and differentiation. The Quran's repeated invocation of past prophets served as a reminder that authority is measured by obedience and moral fidelity, while the unique obligations imposed on Muslims mark the beginning of a distinct religious identity capable of surviving, thriving, and expanding beyond the constraints of tribal and ethnic affiliation. The culmination of this negotiation between recognition and independence is evident in the historical confrontations with Jewish tribes. Initial alliances gave way to conflicts over loyalty, resources, and theological acknowledgement. The Quran records instances in which Jewish tribes are admonished for perceived betrayal, drawing parallels to past communities who disobeyed God's prophets. These narratives, while moralistic in tone, had tangible political implications. Sieges, economic sanctions, and eventual expulsions became instruments of enforcing both divine and communal law. The transition from theological dialogue to political separation marks a decisive point in the emergence of Islam as an independent faith. What began as shared prophetic heritage evolved into a framework where recognition was conditional, law was codified under new authority, and communal boundaries were drawn not merely in political space, but in the moral and spiritual imagination. By the time of the final conflicts in Medina, Islam had established its own claim to legitimacy, drawing from Jewish prophetic tradition, but also asserting a vision that could not be fully reconciled with existing Jewish law and autonomy. The Quranic narratives, legal codifications, and community policies of this period reveal a sophisticated interplay of memory, interpretation, and authority. Islam did not emerge as a rejection of Judaism. It emerged as both confirmation and transformation. The prophetic stories serve as both mirrors and critiques, inviting recognition while simultaneously establishing a new framework of obedience. Law, ritual, and governance are inseparable from theological claims, illustrating that separation was not merely a historical accident, but a structural consequence of claiming universality and finality in the context of an already complex religious landscape. The ethical, political, and spiritual lessons embedded in these early interactions continue to resonate, offering insight into the persistent interplay between heritage, identity, and authority. Muhammad's engagement with Jewish prophetic tradition was therefore not a simple act of borrowing. It was a strategic, moral, and theological negotiation that established Islam as a continuation and yet a decisive break, laying the foundation for centuries of both dialogue and conflict between these intertwined faiths. The development of Sharia in Islam and Halakha in Judaism represents not merely parallel legal systems, but profound embodiments of how law, morality, and divine authority intersect within human society. Long before the rise of Islam, Halakha had evolved through centuries of codification, debate, and interpretation, creating a legal universe that governed every aspect of life, from the minutiae of ritual purity to the broadest questions of justice, commerce, and governance. Rabbis debated not only what God commanded, but how those commands translated into daily action, cultivating a culture in which law was inseparable from morality and community cohesion. The Talmudic tradition, with its dialectical method, preserved multiple viewpoints, encouraging rigorous reasoning while ensuring that decisions were anchored in precedent, scripture, and ethical responsibility. Halakha was more than law. It was a framework of civilization, portable and durable, capable of sustaining Jewish identity across centuries of exile and dispersion. Communities interpreted it within local contexts, balancing survival and fidelity to divine command, creating a moral architecture that could exist without empire, without a temple, and without political sovereignty. Jewish legal reasoning was simultaneously particular and universal, concerned with preserving the integrity of covenantal life while addressing the practicalities of living among empires, tribes, and diverse cultures. Its ethical depth, procedural sophistication, and attention to human behavior ensured that Judaism remained a resilient civilization, capable of influencing its neighbors through law, morality, and intellectual rigor. Into this landscape, Islam introduced Sharia as a legal system both inspired by and distinct from Jewish precedent. The Quran, Hadith, and subsequent jurisprudence codified obligations of worship, morality, criminal justice, and civil life, creating a comprehensive structure intended to regulate individual and communal behavior under the authority of God. Sharia was designed to unify a diverse and rapidly expanding Muslim community, providing a framework that combined moral guidance with enforceable law, public order with private ethics, and divine command with political authority. In its formation, Sharia drew upon pre-existing legal concepts that were deeply familiar in the region, including those found in Jewish law. Dietary rules, inheritance principles, ritual purity, and prohibitions against usury were adapted and systematized, reflecting both continuity and innovation. Where halakha had evolved for survival in exile, Sharia was constructed for the governance of a growing polity, with law serving as both spiritual guidance and civil regulation. The emphasis on obedience to God, ethical behavior, and community welfare echoed Jewish precedent. Yet the scale and universality of Sharia transformed these principles into instruments of empire and statecraft. The similarities between the two systems were evident to both contemporaries and later historians, demonstrating that Islam's legal architecture was born within a matrix of inherited ethical and juridical logic, yet reoriented toward a new vision of authority and universality. The architecture of authority embedded in Sharia diverged sharply from halakha in one crucial respect: enforcement. While Jewish communities relied on local consensus, communal sanctions, and rabbinic authority, early Islamic governance wielded state power to implement divine law. Caliphs, judges, and governors became instruments of religious enforcement, translating the Quran and Hadith into social norms, legal codes, and punishments. This integration of law with political authority allowed Islam to govern not only believers, but also territories under conquest, extending the reach of divine command into public life with unprecedented efficacy. By contrast, halakha remained largely internal to Jewish communities, adaptable but limited by the absence of sovereignty. Jews lived as minorities within empires, applying law within their communities while negotiating compliance with external authorities. This distinction shaped centuries of interaction. Judaism developed as a portable, self-regulating civilization. Sharia as a governing framework capable of organizing and controlling diverse populations under a centralized religious authority. The divergence illustrates that shared roots in prophetic law can yield radically different social and political outcomes depending on the mechanisms of enforcement and the scale of institutional power. The similarities between Sharia and halakha are striking in detail, reflecting a shared legal and moral logic. Ritual obligations, including dietary restrictions, purification rites, and Sabbath or prayer observances, demonstrate a common concern with sanctifying daily life and maintaining communal cohesion. Laws regarding marriage, divorce, inheritance, and contracts emphasize fairness, accountability, and moral responsibility, prioritizing ethical consistency over expedient convenience. Criminal law within both traditions emphasizes restitution, proportionality, and deterrence, while also embedding moral instruction within legal practice. Ethical imperatives are inseparable from procedural rules, ensuring that law is not merely coercive but educative. In both systems, law functions as a medium through which divine will is expressed in human affairs, and through which communities cultivate obedience, integrity, and social cohesion. The underlying principle is similar. Human society thrives when individuals internalize divine command and translate it into daily action, whether through halakha or sharia. This convergence demonstrates that Islam did not emerge in a vacuum, but rather as part of a broader matrix of Semitic legal and moral thought that had already been refined, debated, and tested over centuries within Jewish civilization. Yet while halakha and sharia share foundational logic, they diverge in scope, universality, and political implementation. Sharia's codification was intended for a growing, expansionist faith claiming divine authority over both believers and territories, whereas Halakha was designed for a community navigating life under foreign rule, exile, and minority status. The universality of Sharia allowed it to become the governing framework for diverse populations across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond, integrating conquered peoples into a system of law that blended religious obligation with civil administration. Halakha, by contrast, remained internally focused, creating cohesion, moral guidance, and cultural identity without imposing authority over non-Jews. The contrast illustrates how similar legal and moral foundations can evolve into institutions with vastly different consequences. One expansive, enforced, and political, the other portable, adaptive, and communal. This divergence also created the conditions for centuries of tension, coexistence, and hierarchical relationships between Muslims and Jews. Within Islamic empires, Jews were recognized as people of the book, granted protection and autonomy under Sharia, but constrained by subordinate status, tribute obligations, and legal distinctions. Halakha continued to regulate Jewish life internally, yet it existed within a framework imposed by the larger Islamic polity, demonstrating the interaction between independent legal tradition and external authority. The philosophical and theological implications of these systems further underscore their intertwined yet contested nature. Both Halakha and Sharia operate on the principle that divine law encompasses all aspects of human life, linking morality, ritual, and social order in a comprehensive vision of governance. Both assume that obedience to God's commandments is a precondition for justice, prosperity, and divine favor. Yet their approaches to authority, universality, and enforcement reflect distinct historical experiences. Halakha's internal focus cultivated debate, pluralism within tradition, and a moral imagination tempered by minority existence. Sharia's external focus integrated law with empire, creating hierarchies of power, institutionalized punishment, and mechanisms for societal conformity. These differences illustrate that shared theological and legal heritage does not necessitate identical social outcomes. Context, political ambition, and institutional capacity shape the trajectory of law and practice. The relationship between the two systems reveals a pattern of both convergence and divergence, in which foundational logic is transmitted across traditions but adapted to meet radically different social, political, and historical circumstances. Trade, commerce, and everyday life further demonstrate the interaction between halakha and sharia. Jewish communities under Islamic rule were permitted to maintain internal legal autonomy while also participating in markets, agricultural production, and finance regulated by Sharia. Contracts, commercial obligations, and ethical practices often drew upon both systems, with Jewish law governing internal affairs and Sharia regulating interactions with non-Jews. This dual framework created a complex legal environment in which Jews had to navigate overlapping obligations, balancing fidelity to halakha with compliance to external authority. Sharia's role as state law allowed Islamic authorities to define communal boundaries, enforce taxes, and adjudicate disputes involving Muslims and non-Muslims alike. The interaction between Sharia and halakha created both protection and constraint, enabling Jewish communities to thrive intellectually, economically, and religiously, yet also reinforcing hierarchies that codified Muslim dominance. The tension between autonomy and subordination illustrates how law functions not only as a moral guide, but as a tool of social and political organization, capable of shaping communities in ways that reflect both ethical ideals and pragmatic control. The comparative study of Sharia and halakha reveals subtle yet profound differences in how each system conceptualizes authority, obligation, and the relationship between divine command and worldly power. Halakha operates through communal interpretation and rabbinic authority, emphasizing consensus, debate, and deliberation within the framework of covenantal obligation. Its primary concern is the cultivation of ethical, spiritual, and social coherence within a minority community dispersed across foreign lands, with obedience functioning as a mechanism for survival, identity preservation, and moral cultivation. Sharia, by contrast, was designed for a community aspiring to govern territory, enforce religious and civil law, and integrate diverse populations under a universal conception of divine authority. The codification of Sharia within Caliphal and later judicial structures created a system in which law, religion, and state became inseparable, allowing rulers to wield divine authority through legal enforcement. In this way, Sharia is simultaneously moral, spiritual, and political, whereas halakha, while deeply ethical and communal, remains largely internal, governing only those who voluntarily submit to its authority. The structural divergence reflects the historical circumstances that shaped each system. Judaism, a diasporic civilization, cultivated law as survival. Islam, an emerging polity, cultivated law as both identity and dominion. One of the most striking examples of convergence and divergence lies in dietary law. Both halakha and sharia emphasize prohibitions against consuming certain animals, the ritual preparation of food, and the ethical dimensions of consumption. Kashrut instructs Jews in slaughter methods, forbidden foods, and combinations, linking ritual obedience to moral discipline and communal identity. Similarly, halal regulations in Islam dictate permissible foods, ritual slaughter, and avoidance of certain substances, reflecting concern for spiritual purity, obedience, and ethical consumption. Yet the function of these rules diverges. In halakha, dietary law reinforces minority cohesion, communal discipline, and fidelity to tradition, while in Sharia, it also signals submission to a universal law applicable to all Muslims, reinforcing identity across tribes, cities, and empires. The same principle applies to ritual purity, fasting, prayer, and social obligations, in which Sharia codifies obligations for a universal community, while halakha codifies obligations for a particular, self-regulating people. Inheritance and family law provide another lens for understanding both the overlap and the distinctions. Jewish halakha meticulously codifies rules regarding property division, marital responsibilities, and kinship obligations, ensuring continuity, fairness, and adherence to covenantal expectations. Islamic inheritance law mirrors much of this structure with fixed shares, attention to gendered responsibilities, and preservation of family lineage, yet it extends these principles to a broader, state-enforceable framework. Sharia's integration into governance means that inheritance disputes can be adjudicated publicly, with authority derived from God and enforced by the state, whereas halakha primarily operates internally, with local rabbinic courts mediating disputes among community members. In both cases, law functions as a mechanism to translate divine command into practical social order, yet the scale and scope of enforcement differ dramatically, demonstrating how similar legal reasoning can be adapted to divergent historical and political contexts. The status of non-Muslims under Islamic law, the dhimmi system, illustrates the intersection of Sharia and halakha in governance and hierarchy. Jewish communities living under Muslim rule were often granted protection, autonomy, and the right to practice halakha internally. Yet this autonomy existed within a structure of subordination codified by Sharia. Payment of jizya, restrictions on political authority, and limitations on public display of religious practice mark the boundaries of dhimmi life, simultaneously allowing survival and reinforcing hierarchy. The dhimmi system demonstrates how Sharia converted ethical and religious principles into mechanisms of political control, regulating intercommunal relationships while preserving internal Jewish legal autonomy. Jews were able to maintain education, ritual practice, and economic networks, but they did so within a system defined by Islamic sovereignty, illustrating the complex interplay of legal recognition, moral continuity, and political constraint. The existence of a protected yet subordinate status exemplifies how shared legal heritage can evolve into hierarchical arrangements when political power is asymmetrical. Criminal and civil law further highlights the interplay of authority and moral instruction. Halakha emphasizes restitution, proportionality, and ethical responsibility, ensuring that punishment functions as both corrective and educative. Sharia similarly prioritizes justice, proportionality, and moral accountability, but embeds enforcement within state institutions, extending authority to regulate public and private behavior across diverse populations. Both systems link law to divine mandate, yet the mechanisms of enforcement differ. Halakha relies on communal compliance and rabbinic adjudication, while Sharia leverages political structures to ensure obedience and social order. This divergence underscores the ways in which shared legal principles, concern for morality, justice, and divine obedience, can manifest in dramatically different social, political, and historical outcomes, depending on the context and scale of institutional authority. The evolution of legal and ritual authority within Islam and Judaism also reflects differences in adaptability and pluralism. Halakha developed through centuries of dialectical debate, preserving multiple interpretations and encouraging intellectual flexibility, particularly important for a dispersed, stateless people navigating complex political environments. Sharia similarly developed through schools of jurisprudence, with different madhabs interpreting the Quran and Hadith, yet its primary function was to create a cohesive, enforceable legal framework capable of sustaining governance over large populations. The combination of adaptability and universality allowed Islam to extend its influence across diverse regions while maintaining internal cohesion, whereas Judaism's legal adaptability ensured survival and identity preservation without political power. This contrast demonstrates that while legal architecture can serve as a bridge between traditions, the deployment of law, whether internally for cohesion or externally for governance, shapes the historical trajectory of communities in profound ways. Philosophically, the intersection of Sharia and Halakha illuminates enduring questions of law, authority, and divine command. Both systems assert that human behavior must be measured against a transcendent moral order, yet the implementation of this order reflects historical circumstance. Halakha demonstrates that law can preserve civilization without empire, codifying ethical, spiritual, and social obligations within a minority framework. Sharia demonstrates that law can construct empire, integrating ethics, ritual, and governance to regulate diverse populations under a single religious vision. The convergence of these systems in principle, obedience, morality, and accountability, and divergence in practice, autonomy versus hierarchy, portability versus territorial governance, illuminates the dynamics of continuity and innovation that define Jewish-Muslim relations for centuries. These dynamics illustrate that shared sacred law does not necessarily lead to uniformity, but rather to a complex architecture of similarity, adaptation, and contestation. The architecture of law also shaped cultural, intellectual, and social life. Jewish scholars continued to study halakha, producing commentaries, responsa, and interpretations that maintain communal cohesion and intellectual vitality. Muslim scholars developed fiqh, codifying Sharia across legal, moral, and social dimensions, producing institutions, courts, and educational frameworks capable of sustaining empires. Both traditions prioritize learning, debate, and moral reasoning, creating a shared intellectual universe that informed ethics, governance, and communal identity. Interaction between the two communities, through trade, scholarship, and political negotiation, further transmitted ideas, norms, and practices, demonstrating that even within hierarchical relationships, legal and moral influence could flow in multiple directions. The ongoing negotiation of authority, autonomy, and recognition between Sharia and Halakha reveals a centuries-long dialogue in which law, theology, and politics were inseparable, shaping both the internal coherence of each community and their external relations. The daily life of Jews under Islamic governance illustrates the nuanced interplay between Halakha and Sharia, where law, ritual, and social practice intersected in complex ways. Jewish communities were permitted to administer internal justice according to halakha, resolving disputes over marriage, divorce, contracts, and inheritance within rabbinical courts. Yet these decisions often coexisted alongside Islamic courts enforcing Sharia in cases involving Muslims or mixed parties. The duality of legal frameworks created a delicate balance. Jews could preserve their religious and cultural identity, yet the overarching authority of the state imposed limits and defined boundaries of permissible autonomy. Market regulations, property rights, and commercial contracts provide a vivid example. While internal transactions among Jews adhered to halakha's moral and legal precepts, dealings with Muslim counterparts required compliance with Sharia, including tax obligations, contracts enforceable under Islamic law, and adherence to broader ethical norms codified in the state legal system. These overlapping jurisdictions necessitated sophisticated legal literacy, negotiation, and adaptive strategies, revealing how law operated not only as a moral compass, but also as a mechanism for survival and social integration within a hierarchical political order. Marriage and family law exemplify both the continuity of ethical principles and the divergence of enforcement mechanisms. Halakha prescribes precise guidelines for marital contracts, obligations of spouses, inheritance rights, and divorce procedures, all embedded in centuries of rabbinical interpretation and case law. Sharia similarly structures marriage and family obligations, codifying rights, responsibilities, and inheritance. Yet its authority is reinforced through state mechanisms, with judges empowered to adjudicate disputes and enforce rulings on behalf of both parties. Within Jewish communities, rabbinical courts ensured fidelity to halakha while mediating conflicts, whereas Sharia enforced compliance across religious and ethnic lines, extending authority to the entire polity. This contrast illustrates how similar ethical and legal logic can manifest differently depending on the scale, institutional power, and socio-political context of law. The coexistence of these systems in the same territory created both opportunities for negotiation and friction, as each legal system reinforced identity while defining boundaries of permissible behavior in ways that shaped long-term communal and intercommunal dynamics. Ritual observance similarly reflects the parallel evolution and adaptation of law. Dietary regulations, Sabbath observance, ritual purification, and festivals remain central to halakha, reinforcing communal cohesion, memory, and obedience to God. Islamic practice codified in Sharia integrates parallel concerns with ritual purity, fasting during Ramadan, prayer and pilgrimage, transforming individual observance into a collective, politically recognized framework of identity and belonging. While halakha's enforcement depended on communal commitment and rabbinic guidance, Sharia's institutionalization allowed the state to regulate religious practice, ensuring compliance and uniformity across populations. The convergence of underlying principles, sanctifying daily life, cultivating moral discipline, and structuring social behavior, demonstrates the shared ethical heritage, while the divergence in enforcement and scope reflects the historical and political realities of empire, sovereignty, and community cohesion. Commerce and economic life further illustrate the interaction between Sharia and halakha. Jewish merchants navigated the overlapping jurisdictions of internal law and external authority, balancing fidelity to halakha's ethical and contractual norms with compliance to Sharia regulations governing trade, taxation, and market conduct. The ethical dimensions of finance, credit, and contracts were emphasized in both systems, demonstrating a shared concern with justice, honesty, and accountability. However, Sharia's universality allowed it to enforce contracts, punish fraud, and regulate transactions involving Muslims, creating a legal and social framework in which Jewish law operated internally while engaging with the broader state system. This dynamic shaped both economic behavior and communal strategy, illustrating how legal pluralism functioned as a practical and moral negotiation of identity, authority, and survival. Criminal law provides a further lens to explore competing authority. Halakha emphasizes restitution, proportionality, and ethical rehabilitation, with punishments designed to restore balance and maintain moral order within the community. Sharia similarly emphasizes justice and moral accountability, but integrates enforcement with state authority, including corporal and capital punishments codified in the Quran and Hadith. The capacity of Islamic courts to enforce law over broader populations contrasted with the localized, consensus-driven approach of rabbinical courts, demonstrating how similar ethical imperatives could be applied differently depending on institutional context. This divergence underscores the broader theme of Part 3, law as an architecture of both moral guidance and social hierarchy, capable of sustaining identity internally while imposing order externally. The philosophical and theological underpinnings of Sharia and halakha reveal the depth of their shared heritage and distinct trajectories. Both systems conceive law as an extension of divine will, linking ethical conduct, ritual observance, and social justice into a coherent moral universe. Both emphasize accountability, obedience, and moral responsibility, Yet the scope of authority diverges dramatically. Halakha's primary locus is the community, preserving identity, memory, and ethical fidelity under conditions of political subordination. Sharia extends beyond community, integrating law and state to shape the behavior of both believers and non-believers, creating hierarchies, enforcing boundaries, and consolidating authority. This divergence illuminates how legal systems grounded in similar ethical and theological principles can evolve differently depending on historical circumstance, political ambition, and institutional capacity. It also demonstrates that shared law can create both common understanding and structural inequality, fostering coexistence while delineating power and subordination. The interaction of Sharia and Halakha also shaped intellectual life. Jewish scholars produced responsa, Talmudic commentary, and legal treatises, sustaining intellectual vitality, community cohesion, and moral authority. Muslim scholars developed fiqh, codifying legal, ethical, and social obligations in ways that integrated jurisprudence, ritual, and governance. The presence of Jewish communities under Islamic rule allowed cross-cultural intellectual exchange, with shared concerns about ethics, justice, and communal organization influencing both traditions. Even as hierarchical and political differences persisted, the ethical and intellectual resonance between the two systems fostered a long-lasting dialogue, demonstrating that law functions not only as a mechanism of control, but also as a medium for education, reflection, and moral cultivation. The dhimmi system exemplifies the practical application of competing authority and legal pluralism. Jews were granted protection and internal autonomy while remaining subordinate within the Islamic polity, navigating obligations under both halakha and sharia. Payment of tribute, social restrictions, and legal limitations defined the boundaries of permissible autonomy, yet internal governance, religious observance, and education remained under rabbinical control. This arrangement illustrates the delicate balance between independence and subordination, moral law and political enforcement, identity preservation and hierarchical constraint. The interaction between Sharia and Halakha created a layered legal universe in which shared principles coexisted with asymmetrical power, shaping communal life, social strategy, and long-term identity formation. The centuries following the consolidation of Islam as a distinct faith saw both continuity and rupture in the relationship between Jews and Muslims. Sharia and Halakha had codified a centuries-long dialogue. Yet the rise of modernity would disrupt this delicate balance, forcing both traditions to confront new political, social, and ideological pressures. As empires fragmented and the West exerted unprecedented influence over the Middle East, centuries of relative legal pluralism were replaced by questions of nationalism, sovereignty, and identity. Jewish communities that had once thrived under dhimmi protection now faced the promises and perils of Zionism, an ideological movement premised on the restoration of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. The implications of this movement were seismic. Centuries of Islamic governance, social hierarchy, and jurisprudential accommodation were now confronted with a modern, self-determined political actor whose moral, historical, and theological claims intersected directly with Islamic law and territorial sovereignty. Modernity reframed the ancient dialogue between Sharia and Halakha, moving it from local practice into the global stage of competing nationalisms, legal claims, and prophetic memory. Zionism did not emerge in a vacuum. It was a response to centuries of diaspora, anti-Semitism, and the modern pressures of European nationalism. The Jewish longing for return was infused with religious memory, covenantal promise, and centuries of halakhic deliberation about land, law, and sovereignty. Yet the practical implementation of Zionism confronted the Islamic world, whose political, social, and legal structures were informed by Sharia, dhimmi hierarchies, and centuries of Islamic jurisprudence governing Palestine and surrounding regions. The collision of these two trajectories, Jewish self-determination and Islamic legal political authority, reignited questions that had been latent since Muhammad's interactions with the Jewish prophetic tradition. Who holds legitimacy? Whose law defines the land? Which covenant claims moral and political primacy? Modernity rendered these questions urgent and unavoidable, forcing a reckoning of shared origins, historical interaction, and the long-term consequences of centuries of overlapping law, ritual, and identity formation. Colonial intervention amplified these tensions. European powers, wielding military, technological, and bureaucratic dominance, imposed new boundaries, administrative structures, and legal frameworks that disrupted traditional Islamic governance. The Ottoman Empire's weakening authority and eventual collapse created a vacuum in which both Jews and Muslims had to negotiate new political realities. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising support for a Jewish homeland, formalized the collision between Jewish aspirations and Islamic claims, transforming a centuries-old, primarily juridical and theological dialogue into an acute political crisis. The resulting conflicts were no longer confined to legal reasoning or ritual observance. They were existential, territorial, and deeply tied to identity. Sharia's mechanisms for governance and Halakha's ethical frameworks were now operating within the context of modern nationalism, colonial intervention, and international law, creating layers of tension that intertwine moral authority with political power, theological memory with geopolitical reality. The modern period also magnified theological reflections on shared origins. Jewish thinkers began to reinterpret halakha in light of nationalist goals, seeking not only legal and ritual continuity, but also the practical reestablishment of sovereignty. Islamic scholars and political leaders confronted these developments with a renewed emphasis on Sharia, interpreting sacred law as a guide to preserving territorial integrity, moral authority, and community cohesion. The ancient debates over recognition, prophecy, and law resurfaced in a modern guise. Questions of legitimacy, covenant, and divine sanction were now intertwined with questions of citizenship, statehood, and political survival. Modernity demanded a reconciliation, or at least a confrontation, with the centuries-old entanglement of Jewish and Islamic legal, theological, and historical memory. The stakes were existential. The failure to navigate this reckoning could and did produce conflict on a scale unmatched by previous centuries of negotiation, coexistence, and hierarchical accommodation. The ideological dimensions of this reckoning are evident in both Jewish and Muslim responses. Zionism asserted historical, religious, and legal claims to the land, drawing on centuries of covenantal memory encoded in halakha and Jewish liturgy. Islamic responses invoked Sharia, history, and the moral authority of centuries of governance to defend claims to territory, sovereignty, and moral primacy. Both traditions drew legitimacy from sacred history, law, and prophetic memory. Yet the interaction was now framed by modern notions of nation-state, sovereignty, and international law. The collision transformed what had once been a largely juridical dialogue into a political and ethical struggle of global significance. The shared origins of these faiths, encoded in centuries of intertwined law and memory, became both a source of connection and a point of acute tension, forcing adherents to confront the legacies of shared law, ritual, and prophetic acknowledgement in a radically new historical context. Demographic, economic, and social factors intensified the conflict. Jewish immigration, facilitated by colonial powers and global networks, introduced populations committed to national self-determination into regions governed under Islamic legal frameworks. Muslim communities, historically accustomed to the dhimmi system, suddenly faced a modern political entity whose claim to sovereignty challenged traditional hierarchies. Sharia, once sufficient to regulate intercommunal relations, now interacted with modern legal institutions, international diplomacy, and ideological contestation. Halakha, historically internal and communal, now became infused with political ambition, navigating questions of civil governance, territorial claim, and international legitimacy. The interplay of law, identity, and political power created a dynamic in which ancient legal and moral reasoning collided with the pressures of modern nationalism, transforming centuries-old religious and legal narratives into catalysts for contemporary conflict. The intellectual consequences of this transformation are profound. Scholars on both sides began to reinterpret sacred texts, prophetic traditions, and historical memory in light of modern realities. Halakha was reframed to support not only ritual and ethical life, but political sovereignty, immigration policy, and territorial claim. Sharia was reasserted as a guide not only for personal piety, but for communal governance, national law, and territorial defense. Religious narratives, once primarily theological, now carried immediate political significance. The historical interactions between Muhammad and Jewish tribes, the shared legal frameworks of Sharia and Halakha, and the centuries of coexistence and conflict became sources of argument, precedent, and moral legitimacy in the shaping of modern Middle Eastern geopolitics. The reconciliation of history and modernity proved elusive, as centuries of layered law, ritual, and identity could not easily be translated into the frameworks of modern nation-states, creating tensions that continue to reverberate across the region. The story of Islam and Judaism, entangled for over 14 centuries, finds its culmination not in scripture alone, but in the unfolding dramas of modern history. From the earliest exchanges in Medina through centuries of coexistence under Sharia and Halakha, the narrative has oscillated between dialogue and conflict, continuity and rupture, recognition and assertion of authority. Modernity, however, transformed these patterns in ways unprecedented, placing both faiths on a stage where ancient law, prophetic memory, and ritual tradition collided with nationalism, imperialism, and global politics. The rise of Zionism, the collapse of empires, and the spread of European influence forced a final reckoning of the shared origins between these intertwined religious traditions. No longer could Jewish and Muslim communities rely solely on the internal mechanisms of law, ritual, or ethical discourse to navigate existence. The very fabric of identity, territoriality, and sovereignty was now in question, demanding new interpretations, strategies, and responses from both sides. The history of coexistence became inseparable from the history of conflict, and shared origins became both a source of connection and a battleground for legitimacy. Zionism, emerging in the late 19th century, brought the millennia-old Jewish aspiration for return into the realm of political reality. The movement reframed Halakha not only as an internal ethical and ritual guide, but as a legal and moral framework supporting national restoration. Ancient covenants, promises of the land, and prophetic narratives were translated into modern political claims, infused with urgency, ideology, and international diplomacy. For the first time in centuries, Jewish law and prophetic memory were not only tools of communal survival, but instruments of sovereignty and state building. The implications for Islamic governance, still informed by centuries of Sharia and dhimmi structures, were profound. Territories once governed by Muslim law and hierarchical accommodation were now contested, not merely in theological or ritual terms, but in the political and military arenas of modern geopolitics. The encounter forced both traditions to confront foundational questions: who possesses legitimate authority, how historical claims are validated, and what role divine mandate plays in contemporary political life. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of colonial powers accelerated the confrontation between shared religious origins and emerging nationalist ideologies. European mandates imposed legal frameworks, administrative boundaries, and political priorities that disrupted centuries of Islamic jurisprudential authority. Sharia, once sufficient to mediate relations and enforce law across diverse populations, now intersected with foreign legal codes, nationalist movements, and global diplomacy. Islamic scholars, political leaders, and ordinary communities had to navigate an unprecedented landscape in which religious law and historical memory were entangled with international mandates, military occupation, and rapidly shifting demographic realities. Jewish communities, supported by global networks and European powers, pressed claims based on ancient promise, covenantal law, and modern nationalist ideals, while Islamic authorities asserted Sharia-based legitimacy, territorial sovereignty, and historical continuity. The dialogue that had once occurred within Medina and across centuries of Islamic empire now unfolded on a geopolitical chessboard, with consequences not only for ritual observance or internal law, but for survival, identity, and the political futures of millions. This period also revealed the enduring influence of Sharia and Halakha on social, cultural, and legal life. Halakha, though historically designed for internal governance, now interfaced with statehood, immigration policy, and territorial administration. Jewish legal scholars, drawing upon centuries of commentary and jurisprudence, provided ethical frameworks for governance, property law, and national organization. Sharia, applied both through legal scholars and institutional mechanisms, became a source of resistance, moral authority, and community cohesion for Muslim populations confronting demographic shifts and political marginalization. Both legal systems, once primarily tools of ritual and moral guidance, now carried immediate, tangible implications for political sovereignty, territorial control, and societal organization. The centuries-long architecture of shared law thus transformed into a living negotiation over power, identity, and legitimacy, with each tradition drawing upon its deepest historical and ethical resources to navigate a radically new context. The outbreak of conflict following the establishment of Israel in 1948 exemplifies the culmination of these intertwined historical trajectories. Centuries of coexistence under Sharia, internal autonomy under dhimmi arrangements, and negotiation through ritual and law could not prevent the eruption of violence rooted in overlapping claims of sacred history, moral authority, and territorial legitimacy. Jewish and Muslim communities faced existential questions: the survival of communal identity, the preservation of religious and legal principles, and the defense of sovereignty. Halakha informed national policy, moral reasoning, and internal cohesion, while Sharia provided a framework for ethical guidance, social mobilization, and religious legitimacy in response to modern warfare, displacement, and political challenge. The ancient patterns of dialogue, negotiation, and hierarchical coexistence were now intensified, politicized, and globalized, demonstrating how shared origins could become both a point of connection and a catalyst for enduring conflict. The human consequences of this transformation are profound. Millions of individuals live lives shaped by the historical, legal, and religious precedents of centuries, their identities informed by both halakha and sharia, yet constrained by modern political realities. Ritual practice, ethical reasoning, and historical memory continue to guide daily life. Yet these practices now exist within overlapping systems of national law, international diplomacy, and contested sovereignty. Education, cultural transmission, and religious observance preserve the moral and intellectual frameworks developed over centuries, while the pressures of modernity compel adaptation, reinterpretation, and negotiation. Individuals navigate dual allegiances to ancient law, prophetic memory, and community tradition, and to the imperatives of modern nationhood, citizenship, and international norms. The tension between these realms exemplifies the enduring complexity of the Jewish-Islamic relationship, demonstrating that shared origins are not merely historical curiosities, but active forces shaping contemporary life. Ethical reflection, historical consciousness, and political strategy all converge in this final reckoning. Scholars, leaders, and communities are compelled to reinterpret sacred texts, legal precedents, and historical memory in light of contemporary realities. Questions of legitimacy, covenant, and divine authority must be reconciled with the demands of political survival, social cohesion, and international recognition. Both halakha and sharia continue to provide moral and legal guidance, yet their application now requires navigating the intricate landscape of modernity, nationalism, and global interconnectedness. The legacy of shared origins informs every negotiation, every claim, and every act of diplomacy, highlighting both the enduring resonance of these traditions and the challenges inherent in reconciling ancient law with contemporary reality. The reconciliation of shared origins with modern political realities remains incomplete, yet the historical narrative offers lessons in continuity, adaptation, and moral responsibility. The intertwined legal systems, centuries of coexistence, and theological dialogue provide models for negotiation, mutual recognition, and ethical engagement, even amidst conflict. Recognizing the shared foundations of law, ritual, and prophetic memory may offer a path toward dialogue, understanding, and coexistence, reminding both traditions that their histories are not solely defined by division, but also by centuries of interaction, ethical reflection, and mutual influence. The final reckoning is ongoing, a complex interplay of memory, law, politics, and morality that continues to shape the Jewish and Muslim worlds. Understanding this legacy is essential not only for historical comprehension, but for envisioning a future in which shared origins inform shared responsibility, ethical engagement, and the pursuit of justice.